Well, let's turn the mic on. All right, that must be better there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, all right. We apologize for that technical glitch there. I blame somebody but me. So if you're just joining us, hopefully you heard most of that. But we're talking about if you registered for this event, we will be sending out an email with a link to a special offer for X-series and GFX cameras and lenses from our partners at Fujifilm. If you didn't register for this event, don't worry about it. If you're just joining us now, send an email to evelyn@thecamerastore.com. It's just EVELYN at thecamerastore.com. We can send those special offers to you directly. And this is exciting because it's on top of the Black Friday events already. So the big part of what I like, what you just contributed to, is anything can happen in a live stream. So this is pretty exciting. But the other part I love about it is the interaction with everybody else. So we will be monitoring the chat room here and looking for comments, looking for questions, because at the end of this great presentation, we are going to have a question and answer period here. So if you're not already familiar with our guest tonight, Patrick La Roque is a professional photographer, writer, and speaker from Montreal, Canada. He's an official Fujifilm X photographer and founder of Cage Collective, an international group specializing in visual storytelling and documentary work. So welcome, Patrick, all the way from Montreal.
Hey, how are you, Dave?
Sorry about the technical issue there earlier.
Yeah. I almost wanted to put my mic on mute just to mess with you, but
Most people want to mute my mic anyways, I find. So
there you go.
So thanks for joining us. What can we expect for
pleasure.
tonight on your presentation?
Me talking
Okay.
about photography, basically. So that should be fun.
So I've looked at some of your work. It looks very interesting. So how about we just get right into it? And at the end of it, we'll have a question and answer period. So if you guys do have questions you want to get out there, put them into the chat room there. I'll collect them. And also, if you don't want to be part of that chat room, just send me an email. It's very simple. It's just dave@thecamerastore.com, and I'll monitor that as well. So Patrick, take it away.
All right, thanks, Dave. And by the way, thanks to Evelyn as well, and the Camera Store, and Fujifilm Canada, and everyone for making this possible. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for being here tonight in this wonderful virtual world of ours. I heard there might be quite a few of you out there, which is great and not at all stressful. So that's fun. No, I'm very happy to be here. Let me just switch, just a quick introduction. So my name is Patrick La Roque. I live in a small town just outside of Montreal. It's called Autoburn Park, which you probably never heard of it. I shoot editorial and commercial photography, high-end spaces, and architectural design as well. As Dave mentioned, I'm also a member of an international collective called Kage, which focuses mainly on its visual storytellings and essays. And I'm also very honored to be a Fujifilm X photographer as well. So as Dave mentioned, we will have a Q&A at the end. So send him your questions and I'll be happy to answer anything I can answer. So let me just pop in here. There you go. So here's a fun question to get us started. What is street photography exactly? You're probably thinking, well, duh, it's an image taken on the street. If we look this up on Wikipedia, it's actually defined as, it's kind of a mouthful, unmediated chance encounters and random incidents within public places. And yeah, that works. There's nothing wrong with it. But here's the thing. Let's say we're out there shooting streets and we're on a corner and we look up and we take a shot of a building. Back in our street shooter group, we'll probably be told that this is now, this is architecture, right? If we shoot reflections in a store window, it might be considered abstract art or something. If we shoot inside the store, however, we're then talking about an interior space. But if we happen to look outside from the store's windows, then we're probably back to shooting street again. We love categories in photography, and that's okay. But not everything fits into a slot. In reality, it's usually quite fluid. What I find interesting about street photography is not so much what's in the frame, but the way we get there. So for me, it's not so much a genre as it is a method. It's a way of approaching the craft of picture making. And it's a method that relies on what? It relies on awareness and instinct, which I think are both a pretty crucial part of photography in general, right? Regardless of the category. So I tend to believe that the lessons of street photography can actually be applied to photography as a whole. The title of today's talk is One-Eye Roaming. And this refers actually to a series of ebooks I've published that are all based on a very, very simple premise, which is exploring the world with one camera and one lens, one prime lens. So a single fixed focal length as opposed to a zoom. I've been doing this for years now, and for me, everything really began with street photography and travels. But it didn't stop there. And what I hope to show you guys is that exploration doesn't need to depend on going somewhere. It can be much smaller in scope, closer, and much more intimate, which is kind of important right now because, given what we've been going through these past 2 years, that's pretty much what many of us have to work with. So I will have some practical tips to share later on. But first, we're going to go on a biographical tangent for a bit, if you don't mind. We all come to photography for different reasons. But I think that at the core of it, we're all trying to capture the world in a way that's meaningful to us, right? Question is, how do we get there? And we often hear about finding our style, but style needs substance. So step one, I think, is understanding what drives us to begin with. Why is it that we're doing this? And it may sound like a really obvious question to ask, but it actually isn't. Especially when we're trying to make a living at this, because that can easily, muddy the waters between what we need to do and what we actually want to be doing. I decided to become a professional photographer. I don't know what I did, air quotes there, but on a whim, basically. And I'm not bragging here because that decision, I don't regret it, obviously, but it was actually kind of clueless at the time. I was working in television and multimedia. I was a partner in a production company, but I was, getting a bit tired of the type of projects that we were working on. And I sold a couple of pictures at some point through a stock agency. This was back when you could still make a bit of money from that. And I just thought, hey, let's do this instead. I had no idea what I was getting into. I had no business plan, so I just basically copied what everyone else was doing. right? So I chose a studio sounding name. I built this very typical portrait website with photo packages and gift certificates, and I even did holiday promotions at some point. 'Tis the season. But one day I was sitting at my computer editing a portrait session, and I just realized I didn't actually like the pictures I was working on. I was not enjoying what I was shooting or how I was shooting it. I was just going through somebody else's motions, basically doing what I thought clients wanted, which is kind of a great recipe to never really grow. So my wife and I had a conversation, and we looked at our finances, and she basically told me to just go and find whatever it was I needed to find, which was very generous of her, and probably a good way of getting rid of me as well. But, you know, I digress. About a month later, I was sitting in a car with my camera and a bag full of lenses, driving off on my own, with nothing booked and nothing clear ahead of me. Just nothing but the very long and winding Trans-Canada Highway. I was heading west, and on my first night, I found a small cabin by a lake in a town called Manawa, which I never heard of before. This was off season, so getting a last minute place to stay wasn't very hard. There was like no one anywhere. And that first evening kind of set the tone. I was on my own in this wilderness, kind of doing the whole Walden thing. The next morning, I started driving again up northern Ontario. I'd stop when I was tired, and I'd sleep in whatever hotel I'd find. I drove through the Canadian Shield. I followed Lake Superior for days, I think. I drove through the prairies, obviously, until I saw the Rockies on the horizon. And I did sleep in Calgary, as I told Dave before we came on air, just one night, just putting that out there. I also got caught in a snowstorm in the Rockies without winter tires because I'm a bit of a moron. Eventually, I reached Vancouver. I took the ferry to Victoria, met a friend over there, and then I just kept on driving. Malahat, Nanaimo. I drove until I couldn't anymore. I drove to the end of the road, right up to the Pacific Ocean. And I stayed a few days, and I hiked around on the trails and beaches, and then I started turning back. Obviously, I shot a lot of landscapes during the trip, right? It's kind of crazy how big and beautiful and empty our country is. But as inspiring as it was, I kind of began to understand that I was much more interested in noise and randomness than controlled vistas. And in fact, my favorite picture from that trip happens to be this one. And let me give you a bit of, I'm just going to switch. Can you guys see me? Okay, hold on. Okay, there I am. Was I there at some point on the screen? Just trying to figure out if my picture-in-picture is working. It is now, anyways. Okay, good. Anyway, so backstory on this. I'm driving through the mountains. I'm somewhere in BC, and I've been on the road for hours. I'm super tired. And there's this strange, it's not even a town. It's like there's a grocery store and like 4 houses. And I see this woman on a horse ahead of me. And she's riding bareback, and but she's dressed to go to the mall, which is completely surreal. And so I just pick up the camera and I point it haphazardly while trying, not to hit anyone or anything, especially not the woman and the horse. And I just press the shutter as I drive past them, crossing my fingers, basically. And the thing is, for me, this image beats any grandiose landscape I might have shot during the trip. And it's not because it's perfect. because it isn't. It's because it's urgent. It's almost like fleeing a scene. And this is the picture that kind of solidified what photography actually meant to me. It was life seized, right? Not staged and not directed or controlled, something purely instinctive. Moments that would otherwise just fade away unnoticed. Photography was not about perfection. It was about the chaos of those in-between moments. And although this is shot way up in the mountains, away from any big city, I mean, there's nothing urban about it, but I consider this to be my first real street pick because it's entirely based on a reaction. And, if we go back to that Wikipedia definition, this is an unmediated chance encounter in a public place.
4 a.m. alarm. In the car by 4:45. Montreal airport at 6:50. Security, then wait and wait. Flight delayed, hop on an earlier departure. Toronto. More time, more delays, ice on the wings. Sitting on the plane, waiting for takeoff. An hour and a half. Wheels up, finally. 1 movie, 2 movies, lost in translation. What the hell, I may as well. 6 hours down, but when I look at the map, there's still 7 to go. Fuck, I'm done. I could just jump off this stupid plane. I'm alive. As soon as we hit the ground, I got my second wind. Took a cab to the hotel, then met up with the gang for dinner. We walked through Roppongi, taking in the wilderness, before crashing, lost to dreams of airships and neon cities. I'm alive and today's wide open. The garden awaits.
That was actually about Japan, so I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. When I came back from out west, I scrapped the website and I did a big reset. I started focusing a lot more on the blog and ended up placing that front and center instead of whatever services I thought people might be looking for. So I made quite a few changes, but it was all, pretty much in transition. About 5-6 months later, I catch an announcement for a new camera that kind of sparks my imagination. And it comes out the following spring, and I buy the last of only 3 units I think they had at my local camera store. And this is actually almost a year to the day after returning from the Western Canada trip. And it's a funky little camera that's called the Fujifilm X100. Now, I'm a Nikon shooter in those days, but my official reason for buying it, because you need one, right, is a 2-week holiday in France with my wife that's coming up. No kids, just the 2 of us, and I just want something smaller. And I don't know it yet, but this trip and that camera are about to change everything. In France, I'm not walking around with a bag full of gear. All I have with me is this small kind of buggy little machine. We're talking version 1 here, right? And nothing else. And you think it would be limiting, right? But the experience is actually a revelation. Not only am I not constrained by the lack of a zoom or other lenses to choose from, I feel liberated. I'm just shooting. I'm not thinking about focal length every time I bring the viewfinder to my eye. I'm not zooming in and out all the time. I've got this 35mm field of view, and that's it. To get closer, I need to move closer, and if something's too far away, well, I either try a different shot or I let it go. It's very zen in a way. And there's a loss of control in the sense that I can't switch to anything else. I'm kind of stuck with what I have. but it's also a new kind of control, because that small window through which I see the world is now predictable on every shot. There's a kind of stability there. It's like a foundation. The other feature that's entirely new for me is that I also quickly noticed that the X100 is making me pretty much invisible. No one cares I'm there, like, at all, right? When people notice, they usually say the camera's cute. So I'm not a threat to anyone, which means I get to shoot anywhere, anytime, in cafes and parks and churches and restaurants and buses, sitting, standing, drinking, just anywhere. And because I can, I do. It's a banquet. The strip became a blueprint on many levels. First thing, I was on a holiday with my wife here, and she's very patient, but she's not going to wait for me while I frame the perfect picture every few seconds. I'd be flying home on my own eventually. So I learned to shoot really quickly without ever actually stopping for more than half a step. I learned to anticipate and react faster. And I found myself glancing, I think, as opposed to staring when capturing images, which made a huge impact on the results, because the moments felt a lot more like they were unfolding compared to what I usually shot before this. There was more of a sense of a before and after, as opposed to something settled and finite. Basically, in the end, shooting on the strip was immersive. And I think it all came down to three specific elements. The first one, proximity. I was not using a telephoto. I was walking around with a 70 to 100 millimeter zoom. So I was usually right there inside the action. I'm sure you guys have heard, that famous phrase from Robert Capa: if your pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough. He was kind of right. Big surprise. Second thing, predictability. I mentioned this before, but with a fixed lens, the field of view was always the same from one image to the next. So there was no shock and no indecision, no time spent fiddling with anything, right? Which led to focus, not being distracted by zooming in or out and trying to decide, what's right. This meant my attention was entirely focused on the moment in front of my lens. The word flow is really popular these days. I'm sure you've heard of this. We hear it everywhere, how it's important to find our flow. That, I think, is what it came down to. Removing indecision created a state of flow. I have a short film I'd like to show you guys. It's actually a lens promo that I recently produced for Fujifilm, but it's also a story that's pretty much in line with what we're talking about today. So I think you might find it interesting. Let me just switch myself off here. There we go. I like Susan Sontag's description. The photographer is an armed version of the solitary walker. But we're not armed for violence. We are armed for exploration. I was introduced to the X series through a 35mm field of view. This was back in 2011 with the original X100. It's a camera that's a milestone in my journey as a photographer for many reasons. But that fixed 23mm 35 equivalent lens was a big part of it, because it became your eye. you had nowhere else to go. I think this essentially came to define Fujifilm cameras for me and the way I would use them, not just for work eventually, but to absorb and to understand life in general, wherever I'd find myself. Later on, I added the 23 Mark I to the X series, and now we have the Mark II. It's a complete redesign that builds on the quality of the original. Faster, quieter, and now with weather resistance as well. Cameras are tools, lenses are tools, and yet they sometimes transcend those boundaries. I've captured so much at this focal length, it's like the song of our lives, really. Lives in constant transformation, like the beating heart of a city. Pick it up. When I'm shooting street or any other type of documentary photography, my main setup is always the same. I use aperture priority, the camera is set to auto ISO, and the shutter type to MS plus ES. This means I'm constantly thinking about depth of field as I walk around. If something catches my eye, my first thought is how much background separation do I want? How deep do I go? It obviously needs to happen very quickly, but it does become instinctive, I think. F8, F4, F1.4. You start anticipating what the scene will require. And it's an important choice because ultimately this is how we guide the viewer. Our decisions provide clues to decipher the code. But beyond the technical lies the truth we are seeking. My images changed at some point. I'm not sure when. It happened slowly, over time. They moved from an examination of the collective to something that's almost an expression of solitude. And it wasn't conscious. I just slowly found myself drawn to stillness, to empty spaces and a certain form of anonymity. As if my eye needed tranquility, a center on which to anchor my thoughts. I don't know why, but what I do know is that our photography is bound to the person we are at the moment of capture. Our hopes, our fears, all of it. And we are in flux. Our world, our lives, our souls. Side note here, I just want to mention that I am not against zoom lenses at all, right? In terms of optics, zoom lenses can be just as good as primes. They can be, they can't be quite as fast as in terms of aperture because physics, but life's a compromise, right? And what you see on the screen right now, that's my typical work kit these days. And that up there, right there, that's the 1024 f4 zoom. And it's actually a workhorse for me. So I just wanted to mention that because I've been, in case you guys think I'm just against zooms altogether. I bought that X100 like 10 years ago. A year later, I sold my Nikon kit for an X Pro 1 and the 35 f1.4, and that was it. And, you know, I've been shooting with Fujifilm as my main and only system ever since. But to this day, regardless of the gear I have access to, and I probably have too many cameras and lenses at this point, you know, you may have noticed I shoot the GFX system as well. Unless I'm on a commercial job, which is obviously different. When I step out the door for family outings, camping trips, or, you know, in the before times, trips to other countries, I bring one camera and one prime lens. In fact, if I'm at home, it's the same thing. When I feel like shooting, there's always a camera around with a prime lens. So the only decision I make is which body, and choosing either a 35 or a 50 millimeter equivalent, which are my two personal favorites. That one camera, one lens thing, let me just bring, just so you guys know I'm actually here. The one camera, one lens thing, you know, it's not about being a purist. I just find that it makes me more receptive to what's in front of me, because it forces me to work with what I see. And this can be surprising at times. You know, we often feel like we need certain types of lenses in order to create certain types of images. An 85 millimeter for portraits, or an ultra wide for landscapes, and often the fear with prime lenses, especially when you're traveling, is that we'll miss a shot because we didn't have the proper focal length for this. But in fact, you know, we'll usually just capture a different image. This is the Japanese countryside, and it was shot through the window of a bullet train with a 50 millimeter lens. This one goes back to the X100 actually, so it's 35, which is obviously more expansive. But in both cases, it came down to distance and framing. Here, a wide angle would have made the man way too small. And by the way, this image would never pass the test as a street image, right? But that's actually what it is. I'm not on a tripod. I'm not waiting for some perfect moment to happen. I'm not telling the guy to hold the pose. We're just walking back to our car. And I happen to be looking out at the beach instead of the town that's on the other side. And I see the man, and I stop, and I frame, and I click, and we move on. You know, this is the original straight out of camera, so it wasn't even cropped. I was actually surprised, although I don't crop that much. But technically, I could have shot this with zoom, but I probably would have missed this frame. You know, maybe the next frame or two would have been fine, but those few seconds of indecision would have cost me this one, because the scene looks very slow and serene, but it actually unfolded really quickly. I just barely had time to bring the camera to my eye and just shoot. The man was like, I don't know, really looking forward to his afternoon swim or something. But basically, when we're shooting with primes, it comes down to acceptance, right? Accepting that this is all right. We shoot what's there and we move on. It sounds limiting, but strangely, the side effect of acceptance over time is the ability to start seeing potential images everywhere. This is a quote from American photographer Dan Winters. I now find peace in the realization that millions of potential masterpieces happen each moment the world over and go unphotographed. And it's from a book he wrote called Road to Seeing, which I really highly recommend if you can find it. And he's addressing the fiction of the one single image to rule them all, right? That if you miss it, you're done because that was the one. But he's also speaking to how rich our visual landscape really is. at all times. There's a dam, I think, that breaks the moment we realize that images are like this wide river, that it's overflowing and never ending. That we can find them while waiting at the airport or stuck in traffic or sitting in a restaurant or at home. When we realize there's no need to wait for something exceptional to happen. The trick is to allow the ordinary to bleed into what we consider extraordinary. And to stop censoring ourselves and to stop worrying about who likes what and to just shoot and experiment. That, I think, is how we eventually find what drives us. I promised you guys some more practical tips, so we can do that. Actually, Dave, are there questions? I see you typing a lot. Do you want? Maybe we can take a couple of questions, or maybe you're just working on something else entirely. Yeah.
On my autobiography here, I'm working on here. Yeah. No,
That's
no. There's typing up my own curiosity questions actually.
Okay.
I mean, you brushed on it briefly there. Was using the X100, which was a very pivotal camera, I think, in the Fuji lineup.
Yeah, it was.
Because it was not only one of probably the sexiest looking camera that's been produced in a long time here, but the evolution of that camera. But it's a fixed 35mm equivalent lens. So it's the classic focal length. Now, we were talking about it earlier. 35mm happens to be one of my favorite focal lengths, so I have to choose that. Yeah. And I know if you can touch on that a little bit more, why 35mm is such a valuable focal length.
I think it's the Swiss Army. I said that, I think, in the video, but I really think it's a Swiss Army knife of lenses. Because it can look it can look normal and it can look wide easily, depending on how you frame images and depending on the subject matter. So I've always found it to be, it's something you can just pick up and you can do a whole lot of different types of images with. It's funny because I've gravitated towards 50mm a lot in the past years. Yeah, which is another typical focal length, right? And I still don't feel like I'm missing anything when I'm shooting, and it's a lot tighter. I think your brain changes at a certain point, and you adapt. But if I need something that's all encompassing, I'll reach for the 35 every time.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a reason why it's one of the most valuable focal lengths in a kit there. So the 50 kind of surprised me a little bit there. Did you get you want to challenge yourself a little bit more? Or you got a little tired of the 35, or?
You know what? It's as basic as at some point I got the I think it was the X Pro 2 that Fujifilm sent me with. Before it came out. So I got that with the 35 f2. I think they were releasing shortly after. And I started shooting with that, and I actually went to Japan with that kit. That was my one eye kit for the Japan trip. And it sort of got into it. And I shot the entire trip with a 50mm. And as I said, when I switched to the X Pro 1, the one lens I bought was the 35 f1.4. So basically I had the X100 for a whole year. I had the X100 and the X Pro 1 so I had a 35 and a 50. And I was working with that all the time.
Interesting.
Making it work somehow. Because actually there were there was the 18 and the 60 for the X series. We were very limited in that time as far as lenses go. So
do you ever challenge yourself and pick a focal length that you're just not comfortable with and go out on the street and just say, I'm just going to shoot this lens and only this lens combination and see what I come up with?
Yeah, I won't travel that way because obviously that could be. But yeah, I've shot with a 90, shot street with a 90, which is interesting, and it's actually very interesting if you don't use it as a telephoto. If apart from using it for reach, you use it instead for the compression effect. Sorry, I keep hitting this. You're
No
probably
worries.
hearing booms, sonic booms throughout. Yeah, so the 90 is really interesting. And actually, I think Saul Leiter, New York photographer, for the longest time, I would look at his image and think, how the heck did he get that? And he actually shot with a 135 a lot of the time.
Yeah, no, another classic focal length there for sure.
Yeah, and actually the 90 on the Fuji is an equivalent 135, I believe. So
Yeah.
that was an interesting kind of experiment.
So I noticed in a lot of your photographs there, like the one of the Eiffel Tower there, of everybody snapping photographs there, it was great because the Eiffel Tower is amazing, but it's the girl's hand in the corner there really draws your eye. Everybody's taking snapshots and photos with their. Do you find that you're kind of invisible, you're saying earlier with that camera?
Yeah.
But what if you want to go in front of people, actually get people's faces and reactions and stuff? How do you deal with sort of shooting strangers on the street?
I never do that, mainly because I'm not as interested in, the whole Bruce Gilden school of street photography and using a flash, and it can be really interesting, but I don't feel right doing that. Especially now, we can't escape the fact that privacy laws have become really stringent, and a lot has changed, not just here, but everywhere. So I think if you do that, you have to bring the people in, and that breaks the fourth wall in a way. You sort of, they become participants as opposed to, so it's a different dynamic. I think.
So I was kind of thinking about, how do you see? So when you're walking around a scene, when you're walking around on the street, before you even raise the camera to your eye, are there certain elements that you're kind of looking for, or do you just is just sort of instinct that you just find and you're like, wow, this is great. This is some great color here. This is some great shape. Is it just instinct, or are you actively looking for certain elements?
I rarely actively look for something. I'm really just reactive. I'll just walk and walk and walk and walk and walk, and I just, if I see something, I shoot, and then and it's, there you can get amazing pictures by finding the right spot with the right light and the right mood and staying there. But I'm just too impatient to do that. I just walk and react, and that's what I find thrilling. It's not just a question of I just find it thrilling to do that.
Okay. You live in Montreal, which is an amazingly picturesque city, especially old Montreal, of course, right? It's it's one of the older cities in Canada, and there's some amazing stuff there. Do you revisit places time and time again?
Yeah.
You don't get tired of it.
And I think yeah. But then again, I shoot my home all the time, to the point where it's almost ridiculous. But I read once that it's I think it's Gaston Bachelard or something talking about I don't remember, but that revisiting places is like rereading a book, and I found that really interesting, because that's true. When you read a book again. Whoa, sorry. I talked with my hand. I have Italian in me or something. I shouldn't say that. I'm French. So when you read a book again, you see different things and you understand different things. And I think revisiting places has that effect. Plus, the light changes all the time. So it is changing. It's much more fluid than a book is. But I like that idea of rereading space, really. Yeah,
cool. Do you have a couple questions here? We have from Tubin1. He asked, do you use autofocus or zone focus when you're doing street photography? Or do you use autofocus at all? Are you a manual trap shooting? What's going on?
No, I use autofocus, but I use, I think I mentioned it in the video, I'm not sure, but I use AF plus MF, which is in the Fujis. It's a function where you're in autofocus, but you can still, once you're required focus, as long as you don't depress the shutter, you can manually focus. So basically, you can take a shot, you can tweak the focus, but you can take a second shot and you can rack focus between. So I use that all the time. So I get the benefit of the speed of the autofocus, but I can also, if the camera doesn't get it right, I can make my own decision basically. So.
And Gary Clennon has a good question here as well. He says, with the images you capture, what thought process do you use to determine if you have a keeper, so to speak? I'll use air quotes too, like you earlier. If you have a keeper.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the other thing. Do you shoot when you come across something? Do you shoot a couple frames, or are you shooting a couple hundred frames? And what determines whether it's a keeper or not for you?
Yeah, really good question. I don't shoot 100 frames. I often shoot 3. And it's often 3. It's not 2. It's not 4. It's usually 3. I don't know why. I just, and especially when something is moving, like the first one is the reaction, and then sometimes you have a window, right? There's a bit of time, and so you can adjust. So I'll often take 3 images in fast, right after one another.
So are you in single shot, or are you in continuous all the time?
I'm in single shot.
Oh, yeah?
I always use single shot. Yeah.
Interesting.
So it's press. Because actually, if I was using continuous shot, I would be reframing. I'd probably shoot like 20, go which I don't want to do. I much rather. So it's more intentional, right? So you take a shot and then you go, oh, okay, wait a minute, and then you have time to think between them.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, that's part of my problem. Now we have some cameras in the market that are incredibly fast frames per second cameras.
Yeah.
But I found, especially with Fuji, the X100 and the X Pro 3, that it really slows you down, right?
Yeah.
And you tend to take your time, and you have less shots but more keepers throughout the whole series there. So you kind of pre-culling all your photos because you haven't taken as many photos, because what works really works well.
Yeah. And I also I shoot with the EVF all the time. When I first got the X100, I shot with the optical viewfinder, but I shoot with the EVF now. They've gotten really good. And I use there's a function that when you take a picture, you can have the picture you just took appear for half a second in the EVF.
Right.
And I have that on, and I'm used to it. So I see the image, and I can tell even in that half second if it's a keeper or not. Not 100%, but it gives you an idea.
No, that's very interesting. So you have another question from Shashi, who, and I kind of know the answer to this a little bit, so I'm going to revitalize it a bit. But so, do you shoot with full frame or crop sensor? Well, Fuji doesn't make a full frame sensor; they do crop sensor. But do you shoot a lot of street with the medium format? Fuji's been bringing out.
I do not shoot. No, I don't shoot a lot of street with them, and it's just a question of blending in. I've gotten used to, as much as I love the GFX, and I have shot with it because I did a thing for the GFX 50R when it came out, and obviously, I mean, I love the look of those images. I love the look of the medium format sensor, but I like being invisible, and I think you take different types of pictures when you feel that way, when people don't notice you. And it's not about spying. It's just that your relationship isn't the same with what's around you.
Interesting. I'm surprised because the 50S and the 100S are relatively small cameras. They're no bigger than a regular DSLR camera. Really.
I have the old 50S though. Hold on.
Oh.
I have the first generation, so it's slightly bigger. Yeah. Oh. But you're right. I mean, and it's certainly feasible. It's just a question of what feels right, basically.
Interesting. So you mentioned sort of finding your flow, and this is kind of interesting. I mean, sort of the irony today is I was actually out walking around Calgary downtown shooting some street today. That, yeah. Right, I was trying to be inspire myself for tonight's topic, and I wasn't having any luck. Your photos blow mine away today completely. So, but part of that is finding your flow. You shoot what you like, sort of how you like it. But have you ever been into kind of like a creative slump when you're walking around, where you spend way more time walking around than actually shooting?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think every time, oh, absolutely. But every time I've rarely gone out and not come back with something. But every time I go out, it takes about half an hour. It's like you have to get the engine running and the oil flowing or whatever. There's always a period of adaptation. And I actually remember I was in the UK a few years ago doing a workshop, and I had not shot street in a while, personally, just, time constraints and whatever. And here I am giving a workshop on street photography in Bath in the UK, and I was shooting as well. And at some point, I just gave everyone an assignment, and I started walking and shooting, and I saw nothing. And I could see things, but man, it was just. But yeah, it took about half an hour. And it came back, and you have to do it. I think you have to start. I think the worst thing you can do is walk around and go, "Oh my God, this is not good. Oh my God, this is not good." I think you have to kind of start doing it, and then, it starts working. It's kind of a weird thing.
And do you find like street photography is accepted more in different countries? Some countries, when I think street photography, I think New York, right? Like that's the first city that really comes to mind. But how is it sort of accepted in other places that you've traveled to?
Well, again, it has changed in the past 10 years quite a bit, right? 10 years ago, we didn't have the laws that are in place now. So Germany, for instance, I felt, the laws are very stringent, and I was conscious of that. And so you don't take the same pictures, you sort of censor yourself to a certain extent, which is awful, but that's life. So I think street photography as an art form is much harder than it used to be. I saw, I think 3 years ago, the New York Times came out with a series. They found negatives, a box for a project. I think there was a strike at the New York Times, and the photographers on staff decided to shoot summer in New York, right? Because they were on strike and had nothing to do. And those pictures just got stored away. And at some point, 20, 50 years later or something, this was early 70s. So we're talking a long time ago. And so they did an exhibition with the pictures, and they had an online thing so you could see the pictures. And it's crazy. Everyone's happy to be in the shot. It's like, oh my God, it's an event. He's taking a picture. And that doesn't exist anymore. We don't live in that
the irony
world.
is we're having more, everybody has a camera now. There's more photos being taken every day. But
at the same time, there's that sort of weird barrier when someone gets their picture taken, which is strange by a stranger.
That being said, have you ever had any problems with anybody objecting to being in the photograph, or
no? It's never happened.
Any nights in jail? Police officers, things like that.
I was in Siberia for a couple of months.
Speaking of which,
do we? Maybe we should go back to are there any questions left, or do we go back to the?
Let's go back to the presentation. 100%.
Yeah. I'm just watching the time and figuring we might run out of time at some point. Let me just go back here. Yes, we're talking about the more practical stuff. So these are 4 techniques, air quotes again, I'd like to share with you that I use and that might be useful. So first one, inhabit the space. And this boils down to just looking around us. And, yes, it's kind of obvious, but it's also strangely the easiest one to forget. I don't know about you guys. I tend to get tunnel vision when I'm shooting. And the more hell-bent I am on trying to get that one image I'm already seeing in my mind, the more convinced and stubborn I become about it, the more likely I am to miss what's right next to me. And that could turn out to be more interesting. Our brains are terrible because they just want to please us all the time. So they remove telephone poles and wires, and they also hide stuff if we're too focused on a single idea. So I'm personally constantly fighting this and reminding myself to look and look and look again, just in case. And it's often just a question of finding a different viewpoint. This was in Toronto in the pouring rain during a video shoot we were doing. It's a restaurant window. It's full chaos, but we're actually seeing the inside and the outside. This was shot in a bright, neon-lit factory cafeteria in Sendai, in Japan. There was like no mood there at all. But exposing for the exterior suddenly made it interesting. These are all from hotel windows. I love hotel windows. There's always a surprise waiting because you're getting an otherwise impossible point of view. So it's always an opportunity to see something we wouldn't normally see. Number two, deconstruct the moment. I work through stories and visual essays a lot, breaking down the narratives instead of trying to cram the entire message in a single shot, even if it won't be delivered in that form. It just helps me to understand where I'm going. So this is about identifying the pieces within a single scene, fragments, just dividing everything up. Because sometimes the whole is actually not as interesting as the individual parts. And I just find this to be a really great exercise in terms of learning to see images that may not be immediately obvious. Yeah, more images there, sorry. Okay. Number three, embrace the theater, and I'm talking about the theater of life, which sounds very grand, but it's basically just about the layers in any given moment, right? And how all of these come together, even when nothing significant is actually happening. I'm really fascinated by this. By the way, life is this continuous series of naturally occurring scenes. And they're constructed and deconstructed and reconstructed. And the more we pay attention to these moments, I think, the more likely we are to find them. And that's why I believe it's so important to let randomness be part of our method as well. Chaos often provides what control never can. This last one is a bit more esoteric. Forget the meaning. As in, pretend you're an alien from another planet and you have no idea what it is that's in front of you. Photography, as opposed to painting or drawing, is based on elements that already exist in the real world. We're capturing elements that are in front of our lens, and we usually know what they are. And because of this, it can be hard to step away from the reality of those elements. That knowledge creates a bias. But if we forget what a subject means and our relationship to it, we kind of remove preconceptions. It's like squinting our eye. Everything becomes a shape, a texture, and a color. Everything turns into geometry. Even a group of individuals on the street can create a geometry. And we can use this anywhere, but also when we're home, surrounded by the people and objects that we know so much about. This doesn't mean we can't document more literally at some point. There are certainly situations where we should, but It's simply about developing the ability to remove ourselves from that very first level, seeing with new eyes as much as possible. Ultimately, we're interpreters and translators of reality. That's what our cameras allow us to become. And interpreting involves choices. We choose where we aim, what we include, what we exclude. Even if we're trying very, very hard to remain objective, the truth is, as soon as we look, we're making a statement. We're deciding something. So unless it's part of our job requirement, there's no reason to limit ourselves to how things are supposed to be, because we will affect them anyway. And by this, I don't mean, altering everything in an image in post. I'm talking about allowing subjects to be transformed by how we choose to capture them. The word photography means writing with light. It doesn't mean recording with light. And there's a nuance there. We can write an instruction manual, but we can also write a poem or a novel or a play, and it's the same thing with photography. Okay, I'd like to show you one last video before we go to the Q&A, if there's some time. Okay, cool. I've mentioned throughout tonight's talk how the lessons of street photography can be applied closer to home. This film goes through 5 years of pictures in 5 minutes. And so there's a lot of pictures. And it's mostly family stuff, and a lot of it shot at home when nothing special was really going on. So it's basically just our everyday lives. And it's from a few years ago, so the kids are actually older now, but I haven't shown it in a while, and it feels relevant to tonight. There's a lot of avenues we can take as photographers, right? But in the end, the one thing we have in common, whether we're aware of it or not, is that we're all crafting memories. So yeah, here goes. So that's it. Yeah.
So I got a couple questions.
Yeah.
Do your kids ever get tired of you taking their picture? For one?
You know, they're now a few years older, and I'm now very aware. I have to be careful about it. Yeah, I respect that a lot.
So, I mean, honestly, that was, you know, when you look at that video yourself, right? It's really amazing because it's really a testament to why you should have a camera with you all the time and capture these moments in life. I mean, little things like details in your life, whether it's a windowsill or someone's face, you can put together this project, and it's amazing the amount of memories that come back when you watch that. So
Yeah.
you know, it's a fantastic project to kind of to see you do that. So that's pretty cool. Now, what I notice about your photography, and it reminds me all the time, is Fuji tends to give me my most film-like looking images, and I see a lot of your images. They remind me of more film-like. Fuji's fantastic with their in-camera processing. Do you do the black and white processing in camera, or you're a post-processing kind of thing? If you could walk us through your workflow a little bit.
Sometimes I do. I have a preset in the camera that uses the Acros simulation and with a very, very strong focus, so +2 highlights and +4 shadows or something. It's very, very but the thing that I do, I think I shoot in JPEG a hell of a lot.
Really?
Most of my most of my because otherwise those simulations don't matter. If you shoot RAW, I mean, Capture One has those simulations, and they do a good job. But it's not exactly the same thing. You're not running the actual CPU from the camera, so it's different. So yeah, but I mean, this goes back to the X100. When I first got it, there was nothing out there to decode the raw files. So that trip I took to France was all JPEG, and I basically took a leap of faith, and I realized that okay, these JPEGs actually are pretty amazing. And I never stopped. So of course, for you know, my work, I always shoot. I either shoot RAW and JPEG or just RAW, but 95% of my personal stuff is shot in JPEG. So I do use those film simulations as a starting point because I think they do give you a different starting point than you would get from a RAW file.
Yeah, I mean, we comment about it all the time. Every time we review a Fuji camera, Fuji is really the only camera that I use preset profiles on because their film simulations are so fantastic. I'm a huge Acros fan. I love shooting in the black and white, bump up the contrast. Maybe it's a cliche, but for me, it's a look that I absolutely love when I shoot with Fujifilm.
Well, I mean, they're a filmmaking company. I mean, that's what they did, right? They didn't just do cameras. They made film. So
now, when you switch from Nikon to Fuji, the X-Trans sensor is unique amongst for Fuji. Did you notice it's subtle at first, but the more you shoot it, the more it's glaring how much difference there is. Did you notice a big difference yourself?
I'm just so used to it now. I don't even have anything to compare with. So, you know, I remember I've been using Capture One now for many years, but I used Lightroom for a long time. I used Aperture actually before that, and yeah, the X-Trans journey was interesting with Lightroom. It took a while for us for the raw files together, for the decoding to actually look. I didn't have super huge problems with it, but there was something there in terms of the sharpening and the way it rendered stuff.
Okay, so we got one more question in the room, and then I have another comment here, but I have to say it because it's another Dave, so I can't ignore Dave. And I got some air quotes coming here too. So, do you think labeling something street photography serves as useful, positive purpose, either in your case or in general?
I don't care for the term, actually. I as I said, you know, street photography, you know, where does it end, actually? You know, when I'm shooting at home, I'm shooting in exactly the same manner that I would be when I'm shooting street. You know, I'm not telling my kids to stay there and do that, and I'm just basically reacting. When I'm shooting editorial stuff, I'm reacting. So for me, it's all documentary work in some form. So I don't know where the street ends. I don't know, you know, if I step off the street and go into a field, it's no longer street. So yeah, I don't actually care for the term street photography, but it is useful to identify a certain way of shooting.
Okay, interesting. I mean,
That makes sense.
you're a Fuji shooter. You put together some great videos here. Is video something that's
Thanks.
a bigger part of your work more than ever? I mean, Fuji's really come on
it's not
strong
a-
with with video.
Yeah. It's not a bigger part. I come from video, strangely. I studied cinema. So, and I actually fought that. I didn't want to do it. I've been sort of forced back into it, but I enjoy shooting short films like that. It's a completely, there's so much more overhead with video, and you know that, right? It's just everything from storage to the equipment to there's so much stuff to think about. So I love the simplicity of photography in that regard. But it's a challenge. I like, what I love about film and video is that, you know, I'm a musician as well, so I do the music. It's like a whole thing. You can actually create an entire little world there, you know, with a soundtrack, with images and with stills. It all, I like that. It's an interesting way of working. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's sort of like wrapping things up a little bit. What's your like number one sort of tip or the number one lesson you want to get across to people after tonight's presentation?
Wow.
Put you on the spot.
Yeah, you do. No kidding. Don't be afraid. Don't put yourself in a box, and you know, if you see a candlestick and sunlight falling on it and you think it's beautiful, just shoot it, and even if it's just a candlestick, and find a way of shooting it that'll be interesting. And that's, you know, when you're able to see these images that would normally not be interesting and make them interesting, then you start seeing them everywhere, and you can apply that on the street or at home or in, you know, wherever you are. It just, yeah,
Awesome. Yeah.
train
I mean,
your eye, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, carry a camera with you everywhere you go, and keep your eyes open. I tell people that all the time. Always be looking, because something will come up. You know, if we, and I'm guilty of it at times. I'm staring at my phone far too much, but you know, put the phone down and look around the street. Look at what you see, because we often don't see what's right in front of us. So
Yeah.
that was awesome. So I'm going to wrap this up. I want to thank Fujifilm for sponsoring this, and Patrick, it's been fantastic. It's been great getting to know you over this our chat here and seeing a lot of your images there. So welcome for that. I just want to remind you that if you haven't registered for this event and you want to take advantage of the special Fujifilm deals we're going to offer you, make sure you send an email to Evelyn at Evelyn@thecamerastore.com, EVELYN at thecamerastore.com, and she will send that off to you. And I want to thank you guys for joining us tonight. It's been a lot of fun, and we hope to catch you again next time.
Thanks.